Lucas Kane was a 16-year-old boy with dreams of becoming a soldier in an elite special ops unit. But his ambition would lead him down a dangerous path, one that would cost him his life. His parents, Jane and Richard Kane, thought their son was simply missing, until they uncovered a dark truth that revealed their boy had been drawn into a secret, global network of covert operatives. A network so powerful and so elusive that Lucas's tragic death was just one piece in a puzzle far more sinister than they could ever have imagined. This is the true story of how Lucas Kane became a pawn in a game of secrecy, and how his family fought to uncover the shocking truth behind his murder. In the small, quiet town of Ravenswood, Lucas Kane was the kind of teenager everyone noticed. Tall, athletic, with a piercing focus in his eyes, Lucas had an energy about him that drew people in. By day, he was a straight-A student with a love for history, particularly military history, and by night, he was the star of his high school's track team, often the first to arrive at practice and the last to leave. But Lucas wasn't just an ordinary teenager. Beneath his well-rounded exterior, there was a burning desire to be more, to push himself beyond the limits of what anyone expected. It was this relentless ambition that set him apart. From a young age, Lucas had been fascinated with the idea of soldiers, special forces, covert missions, elite operations that seemed to blur the lines between heroism and danger. His room was lined with books about military strategy, tactics, and the lives of soldiers who had operated in the shadows. He had watched countless documentaries and read every biography he could find about men who worked in special ops. To Lucas, these were the real heroes, not the ones on the big screen, but the ones working quietly in the background, changing the world without anyone knowing. In his sophomore year, Lucas joined the high school's ROTC program, a step towards his dream of one day serving in the military. But he quickly realized that the program didn't offer the kind of challenge he was looking for. While the other cadets seemed content with the basic drills and routines, Lucas craved something more intense, something beyond what any high school curriculum could provide. He started taking evening classes on combat techniques, survival skills, and cryptography. These were skills that many adults might have found unnecessary for a teenager, but Lucas saw them as essential for his future. What Lucas didn't realize at the time was that his intense passion for special operations was drawing attention from places he didn't expect. A few months before his disappearance, he had received an unsolicited email from an anonymous source. It was a cryptic message, offering him an opportunity to join a special operations program. The email was full of jargon and military terminology that Lucas knew well, and the mention of advanced recruitment and elite teams was enough to catch his attention. The message was brief but intriguing, promising an opportunity to join a team that would train him in real-world scenarios and missions that were far more intense than anything he had experienced so far. It wasn't an official military recruitment. There was no logo or standard government protocol. It felt like something off the books, but for Lucas, it felt like a door opening to a future he had dreamed about for years. His curiosity got the best of him, and he responded to the email, asking for more details. What followed was a string of messages, each more encrypted and secretive than the last. There were mentions of discreet assessments and high-value training, and Lucas was asked to submit several tests, written, physical, and mental, that would determine his suitability for the program. To Lucas, it seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. He was about to be part of something greater than anything he had imagined. But there was also a sense of foreboding in the messages, hints that the program wasn't just about training. It was about the kind of work that wasn't meant for the public eye. Still, the allure of becoming part of an elite group of operatives blinded him to the risks. The more he engaged with the mysterious organization, the more he felt drawn in. His friends and family noticed a change in Lucas as he became more distant, more secretive. His usual drive on the track field was matched only by an increasing obsession with training and preparation. He stopped hanging out with his friends after school, and when he did socialize, it was only about military tactics, covert operations, and what he called real-world missions. Lucas was consumed by the idea that he was on the verge of becoming someone extraordinary. Someone who would change the world in ways most people couldn't even imagine. But as the days passed and Lucas moved closer to making a decision, there was a growing sense that he might be stepping into something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. It wasn't just about joining a team. It was about crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. And though Lucas hadn't fully grasped it yet, the decisions he was about to make would cost him everything. The morning after Lucas had shared his excitement about the mysterious Special Ops recruitment, he disappeared. His parents, Jane and Richard Kane, assumed he was just out for one of his usual early morning runs. It was something Lucas often did. He liked to clear his head by running for miles, pushing himself harder each time. He had a routine, and it was comforting for his parents to know that he had such discipline in his life. But when the hours passed and Lucas didn't return, their concern began to grow. By mid-afternoon, the worry turned to panic. His parents called the police, but at first they didn't take the case too seriously. After all, Lucas was 16, prone to disappearing for hours on end, getting lost in his thoughts. But this time was different. Lucas had left behind his phone, his jacket, and his backpack at the local park, the same park he had passed by on countless runs. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious clues as to what might have happened. The only thing that seemed strange was the absence of his usual items, as if someone had been expecting him to vanish without a trace. The police began their investigation, starting with his friends and classmates, trying to piece together the last time anyone had seen or heard from him. One friend, Mark, recalled seeing Lucas the day before, in high spirits, excited about some big opportunity that had come up. He didn't know much about the details, but Lucas had hinted that it was something top secret, an offer that would change his life forever. Mark said he didn't take Lucas too seriously, assuming it was just another one of his wild ambitions. But then there was something unsettling. A series of messages Lucas had sent to another friend, Sarah, late the night before his disappearance. They weren't the kind of texts someone would send in a casual conversation. The words were disjointed, cryptic, almost like a warning. "They're following me," one message read. "I don't know if I can trust them anymore." And then, a final message that read, that last line sent chills down Sarah's spine. Was Lucas in trouble? Had he gotten involved in something dangerous? And if so, who could have been following him? The messages were vague, but they painted a picture of someone who was scared. Someone who had felt the weight of a decision that might have been too heavy to carry alone. As the hours turned into days with no word from Lucas, the police started to suspect foul play. They traced his last known location, an area near the woods on the edge of town where Lucas often went for long, solitary runs. There they found nothing but more questions. His phone had been turned off, and there was no trace of him on any nearby surveillance cameras. It was as if he had simply vanished. His friends, his family, even the police began to ask themselves the same question. Who or what had Lucas been running from? The mystery deepened when a breakthrough came unexpectedly. A hiker, walking along a seldom-used trail through the dense woods, stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. Half buried in a shallow grave, covered with leaves and dirt, was an object that would soon turn out to be Lucas's prized jacket. When the authorities arrived at the scene, they found no body, but there was something even more unsettling. Hidden inside the jacket was a small, encrypted device tucked away in one of the pockets. It wasn't a phone or a typical piece of technology. It was something far more sophisticated, and it immediately raised alarm bells. Who would have left it behind? Why did Lucas have it? And more importantly, what was on it? The police couldn't unlock the device right away, but it was clear that Lucas had been involved in something more sinister than they had initially thought. His sudden disappearance, the cryptic messages, and the hidden device pointed to a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Lucas hadn't run away. He had been lured into something he couldn't escape. It had pulled him into a dark and dangerous world, one where his talents were noticed, but at a terrible cost. The hunt for answers had only just begun, and with each new discovery it became increasingly clear that Lucas had gotten caught in something much bigger than himself, something he could never have predicted. Months passed with no sign of Lucas. The case went cold. His parents never stopped searching, but as the weeks turned into months, the police began to lose hope. The town of Ravenswood, which had once been a place of comfort and safety, now felt like a shadow of itself. Friends, neighbors, and classmates all held their breath, waiting for any news. But it seemed like Lucas had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Then, one day, the phone rang. A hiker, walking along a remote trail on the outskirts of town, had made a grim discovery. A body, partially buried beneath the thick underbrush, hidden from view by nature's embrace. It was a place few people went, a trail so isolated that even seasoned locals tended to avoid it. The hiker had first thought it was an animal carcass, but upon closer inspection they realized it was far more horrifying. The remains were human. The hiker, terrified, immediately called the authorities. The police arrived at the scene with caution, unsure of what they would find. The area was well known for being a secluded spot, often used by hikers but rarely by anyone else. As they sifted through the dirt, the officers found a body buried beneath leaves and moss, barely recognizable. The moment they identified the body, their hearts sank. It was Lucas Kane. The discovery was both a relief and a nightmare. After months of searching, they had finally found Lucas. But what had happened to him? How did he end up so far from home, in a remote part of the woods, buried in such a way? And most disturbingly, why had someone gone to the trouble of hiding his body so carefully? Forensic investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the circumstances of Lucas's death. At first, the cause seemed straightforward: blunt force trauma to the head. But as they examined the body more closely, they realized something wasn't right. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no signs of a fight. It was as though Lucas had been overpowered quickly and without warning, then carefully hidden away. The lack of marks on his body suggested that he hadn't fought back, that he might have been knocked unconscious before he was killed. Whoever did this had known what they were doing. But the most puzzling detail was the state of his body. Despite being dead for several weeks, Lucas's muscles were unusually well-toned, almost like he had been subjected to a rigorous physical regimen just before his death. This detail raised more questions than answers. How had Lucas's body been so well preserved, even after being buried for weeks? Had he been in some kind of training program or physical conditioning before his death? It didn't fit with the image of a teenage boy simply running from his problems. This was the body of someone who had been pushed to the limit. Perhaps someone being groomed for something much more intense than just high school sports. In the pocket of Lucas's jacket, police discovered an encrypted device, a small, flat piece of technology that didn't belong in the hands of a teenager. The device was sophisticated, not the kind of gadget a young athlete would casually own. The authorities immediately seized it, hoping it might provide the missing pieces to the puzzle. At first, they couldn't access its contents. It was encrypted with a password, a level of security that indicated it was valuable or dangerous. The police sent it to specialists, hoping someone could break the code. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that Lucas's death was no ordinary murder. The circumstances surrounding his disappearance and the strange clues left behind pointed to a far more sinister plot than anyone could have imagined. Whoever had killed Lucas had been careful, methodical, and deliberate. His death wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a message. And the encrypted device, buried with his body, might hold the key to uncovering the truth. The case had taken a dark turn, and the police had no idea just how deep the conspiracy went. Lucas Kane's life had been stolen in a way that seemed almost calculated, as if he had been swept into something much bigger than his quiet life in Ravenswood. Whoever had been behind this was skilled, ruthless, and determined to cover their tracks. But as the investigation continued, one thing became clear. Lucas had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized, and his death was only the beginning of a much larger story. The investigation into Lucas Kane's death had been progressing slowly, but it was beginning to uncover details that raised more questions than answers. The discovery of the encrypted device hidden in his jacket had sent shockwaves through the police department. No one could have predicted the depth of the mystery Lucas had been entangled in. Forensic experts and tech specialists worked day and night trying to crack the device's encryption. The device itself was like nothing the investigators had ever seen before. High-tech, sleek, and well beyond the kind of technology most people would have access to. It was clear that Lucas had been dealing with something far more sophisticated than a typical high school student might encounter. When the device was finally unlocked, the contents revealed a chilling truth. Lucas had been in contact with an underground organization that specialized in covert military operations. It wasn't a government agency, nor was it a typical private contractor. The organization operated in the shadows, its reach extending far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The encrypted files contained correspondence and training schedules, all related to a program designed to groom the best candidates for high-risk Black Ops missions. The messages were sent under various aliases, all encrypted with layers of code to ensure their secrecy. What became clear was that Lucas had been recruited by this mysterious group, drawn in by his exceptional physical abilities and intellectual curiosity. But as the messages revealed, Lucas's involvement wasn't voluntary, not in the way he had initially thought. He had been targeted, carefully chosen, and then manipulated. His fascination with military operations had made him an ideal candidate for the group's agenda, and they had been grooming him for something far darker than he could have imagined. Lucas's training was intense, even by military standards. He had undergone psychological testing, physical conditioning, and advanced tactical exercises. But there was more to it than just training for combat. The group specialized in missions that were classified at the highest levels, dealing with espionage, sabotage, and operations that were too sensitive for any legitimate military force. They had no regard for the usual rules of engagement. There was no accountability, no oversight. In short, they operated outside the law, and anyone involved was bound to remain silent, whether they wanted to or not. The encrypted messages indicated that Lucas had been struggling with his involvement in the program. He had participated in several training exercises, but the further he went down this path, the more he began to question the morality of the group's operations. He had started to express doubts about the missions he was being trained for, and it seemed that he had begun to pull away. The final messages on the device were the most troubling. They suggested that Lucas had tried to back out of the program. He had begun to realize that he was caught in something far beyond his control. But backing out wasn't an option. The organization had no tolerance for defection. The more the investigators dug into the group's activities, the more they discovered about its network. Former military officers, shadowy figures from the intelligence community, and individuals with enough power and resources to operate outside the reach of the law. They had recruited hundreds of people like Lucas, individuals with exceptional talents, but they didn't just train them, they controlled them, manipulated them, and in some cases eliminated them when they became liabilities. It became clear that Lucas had been marked for death once he expressed doubts about the group's true intentions. The brutal way he had been killed, the meticulous manner in which his body had been hidden, suggested that his murder wasn't just to silence him. It was a message to others who might think about leaving. Lucas had been caught in a web of secrecy and manipulation that extended far beyond anything the authorities could handle. The truth was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated, and it was clear that there were people willing to do whatever it took to protect their operations. As the investigation unfolded, more chilling facts came to light. The group wasn't just a rogue operation. It was part of a larger global network that had been operating for years. They had infiltrated various levels of government, the military and intelligence agencies. Their influence was far-reaching and their methods ruthless. And now, Lucas Kane had become another casualty in their cold, calculated mission to maintain secrecy at all costs. The more the investigators learned about the organization, the more they realized how deeply embedded it was in the fabric of global power. Lucas's death was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle that seemed to stretch across countries, continents, and governments. Whoever had been behind his murder was powerful, untouchable, and willing to do whatever was necessary to keep their operations secret. Lucas had been one of their brightest recruits, and when he tried to pull away, he had been eliminated without a second thought. For the first time, the investigators understood the full scale of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a local murder. This was an operation that had the potential to shake the foundations of power itself. And with every new detail that surfaced, it became increasingly clear. Lucas Kane had been a pawn in a far bigger game. A game with rules that no one in the public could ever comprehend. As the investigation into Lucas Kane's murder continued to unfold, the truth became darker and more complex than anyone could have imagined. Each revelation led to another, and with each discovery it became clear that Lucas had been caught in a far-reaching conspiracy. What had started as a missing persons case had evolved into a global manhunt for answers. And the deeper the authorities dug, the more they realized they were up against a well-organized, ruthless network operating outside the boundaries of law and order. The encrypted device Lucas had been carrying provided critical clues, but it was only the beginning of what seemed like an endless trail of information. As investigators dug into the organization Lucas had been recruited by, they uncovered a series of highly secretive operations that spanned across the globe. The group was not just a rogue faction of disgruntled military officers or private contractors. It was an underground network of operatives working under the guise of a private military company, but with connections that went far beyond anything law enforcement could track. They were involved in covert operations that included espionage, sabotage, and illegal military interventions in unstable countries. Their recruits were carefully chosen. People like Lucas, with exceptional physical abilities, sharp minds, and the willingness to push themselves beyond the ordinary. But this wasn't just training for combat. It was a form of manipulation, of grooming young men and women for missions that were morally and ethically ambiguous, if not downright illegal. The more the investigators uncovered, the more they realized that Lucas had been a pawn in a far larger game. He had been recruited not because of his desire to serve his country, but because he was a perfect candidate for their covert operations. Lucas had been chosen for his mind, his body, and his ambition, but also for his naivety. He had been drawn in by promises of elite status and adventure, not realizing that once someone entered this world, there was no escape. The moment he had questioned the group's motives, he had become a liability, and that was why he had been silenced. But what the investigators didn't yet know was just how far the organization's influence reached. As they pieced together information from former operatives, whistleblowers, and intercepted communications, they discovered that the network was far more entrenched than they could have ever imagined. The group had infiltrated various levels of government and military, using its influence to avoid detection and cover up its tracks. They had operated in the shadows for years, and it was clear that they had the power to protect their own. Even after Lucas's death, the organization continued to operate, its members seemingly untouchable. Despite their best efforts, the authorities were running out of leads. They had uncovered the existence of the group, but finding out who exactly was behind it and how to bring them to justice was a daunting task. The people responsible for Lucas's death were well-connected and powerful, and any attempt to expose them was met with fierce resistance. Key witnesses disappeared, evidence was destroyed, and anonymous threats were sent to those who dared to continue the investigation. The deeper the police went, the more they found themselves up against a wall of silence and intimidation. It was becoming clear that they were fighting an enemy they couldn't fully comprehend, let alone defeat. Lucas's parents, devastated by the loss of their son, continued to search for answers. They refused to let his death be swept under the rug. Jane and Richard Kane had always believed in justice, but now they were learning that not all battles could be fought in a courtroom. They had no idea just how deep their son had been involved in a world that operated outside the law. The news of Lucas's death had shocked the town, but as the investigation dragged on, people began to realize that this was no ordinary murder. It was the result of a hidden, dangerous world that had ensnared an innocent young man, and the ripples from his death were beginning to spread far beyond Ravenswood. Lucas's death wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. His murder had exposed a global network of covert operatives that could not be easily dismantled. It was an organization that operated in the shadows, working to maintain its secrecy at all costs. And while the authorities had gained some insight into its operations, they were nowhere near close to exposing its full extent. As for the mastermind behind the group, their identity remained a mystery. But the more the investigation continued, the clearer it became. Lucas had been just one of many, and his tragic fate was a warning to anyone who might try to escape this shadowy world. The case had changed everything. It had shown just how vulnerable people like Lucas were to being manipulated by forces they didn't fully understand. But it also revealed the lengths to which powerful organizations would go to protect their secrets. Lucas's death was a catalyst, sparking an inquiry into private military contractors and the covert operations that had become an increasingly dangerous part of the global landscape. His story became a symbol of the cost of ambition, the dangers of the unknown, and the price one pays when they get too close to the truth. While justice for Lucas Kane remained elusive, his tragic story was not forgotten. His legacy would live on, not just in the hearts of those who knew him, but in the unanswered questions that haunted the investigation. For the people who were part of this dark world, the story was far from over, and for those still in its grip, Lucas's death would remain a constant reminder that no one could ever escape completely.